Mr. Hopson.
Morning. Good afternoon. Sorry.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming to give evidence to us. Is there anything you would like to say by way of opening statement?
Yes. So I'm the Chief Executive of NHS Providers, as you know. We're the membership organisation and trade association for the 238 hospital, community, mental health and ambulance trusts and foundation trusts. I'm not an FOI expert. I'm here as an advocate for the views of our members that we've gathered together on for this session. Just to give you a very brief, quick overview about how our members kind of see this. So we spend, I think, 10% of public expenditure, so £75 billion goes through our members, and I think they recognise the need for public accountability on the back of that. They work very hard, I think, at publication schemes, open board meetings, huge amounts of NHS data published. I think there's widespread support amongst our members for the principles of the Act as an important mechanism to exercise public accountability. And I think they support the idea of members and others asking legitimate questions. However, they tell us that particularly recently they are experiencing a very rapid growth in the number of questions, of particular types of questions from organisations that the Act, in their view, never envisaged, and that this is placing a very disproportionate impact on them. And I think they believe this Commission provides a very well-timed opportunity to address that. So just to very quickly talk about some specifics, if I can give you 6 examples, I think 5, and then there's a 6 which is more questionable, of examples where they believe they are being placed on a disproportionate burden. They are finding they are getting very significant numbers of FOI requests from people who are commercial companies who are just solely looking for names so that they can then create databases of names and they can then be sold to third parties, or they're used for marketing material. The second is they are getting very significant numbers of requests for what is clearly commercial information from suppliers who are seeking to effectively run round procurement processes when that information, to be frank, should be provided through appropriate procurement process. They are getting large numbers of requests from students doing basic research projects. They feel they get a number of frivolous requests. They also feel they are getting, as a 5th category, a number of FOI requests from complainants who have addressed their complaints through other parts of the system, had them adjudicated on, but they're then kind of coming back again for further requests. There is a 6th category, which I don't want to dwell on at this point because I think it's more difficult and I don't want to undermine the strength of the previous 5 categories, but effectively there clearly is an argument about particular types of requests from media organisations where effectively I think nobody is disagreeing with the idea that media ought to be asked focused questions to hold to account. I think you'll have heard the use of the word fishing trip before, but effectively I think there is a view that they are subject to a much larger number of fishing trips. So if you ask our guys, about our members, about what proportion of FOI requests come from individual members of the public and what come from those categories, they are now telling us that the majority to the significant majority are coming from those categories. And their view is that that was never intended to be the intention of the Act. They also would say to you that they note that significant numbers of those people are seeking to then pursue appeals at various levels through that, which is also placing a burden upon them. I do have for you, I don't wish to outstay my welcome in terms of my opening statement, 3 sets of specific remedies that we would propose to you to deal with those categories. So I'm happy to give them to you now, or happy to... Okay. So we think there are 3 kind of sets of remedies. The first is really around vexatious requests. And we noted with some interest paragraph 61 of the FOI Commissioner's written evidence to you, where he said he would be opening to strengthening the guidance on section 14, which is the section covering vexatious guidance, by putting it on a statutory basis in a special code of practice issued under section 45. And he notes this could reduce any uncertainty that public authorities may feel about the current approach and the risk of the Commissioner's guidance being overturned by the courts. I did note with not entire agreement, that he seemed rather frustrated with us when he said to you in his oral evidence, "I wish public authorities would actually use the provisions of the Act to turn away some of the most burdensome stuff. We've got clear exemptions in Section 14 of the Act, and we've issued very clear guidance." If you look at the guidance, actually, I think we would perhaps suggest it's not quite as clear as he is suggesting. It is only effectively aimed at us as public authorities. It's not aimed at people making requests. So I think our view would be we can imagine a process where in the drawing up of this statutory code, we might all sit round the table and agree what is vexatious and what is not. And I think we would argue very strongly in that process that trawling for names, that trying to circumvent procurement processes, frivolous requests and people who use the system as an attempt to pursue a complaint that's already been adjudicated on, I think we would argue would be examples of vexatious. If it was put in a statutory code, we'd all be clear, both public bodies and people who are making requests, about actually what was vexatious and what was not. So we think that, for us, would be remedy number one. Remedy number two, and again we thought paragraph 67 of the FOI Commissioner's evidence was interesting when he said, if a change to the cost regime of FOI, of the Freedom of Information Act, is deemed necessary, the Commissioner would support the conclusions of the Justice Select Committee that reducing the appropriate limit in the fees regulation would be the most proportionate step to reduce the impact of the FOI Act on public authorities. So again, I think, as you know, it's a current limit of £450. That translates as 18 hours work, £225 an hour. Depending on how you define a working day, that is effectively 3 working days' worth per FOI request of an individual. And again, I think, as you know, there is a debate about whether you are allowed, you're not currently allowed to include the very detailed work that our members have to do on both redaction, but also, crucially, having the discussions around which exemption clauses to use. And to be frank, it's quite often quite a technical debate about which exemption clauses should be used. So I think our argument would be that that cost limit should be reduced. I think you would ask me straight away, well, what would you reduce it to? I think our view perhaps would be 1 working day, which you might define as 7 hours as opposed to 18 hours. And I think we would strongly make the argument to you that we believe that all the costs of considering these requests ought to be taken account of, and that actually you should consider the time that our members have to spend considering exemptions and redaction. So that would be our second remedy. Our third remedy would really be around appeals. And I suppose when you talk to our members, what they say to us is it's not just the need to kind of process the original request, it's actually then the pursuit of appeals. And I think our view is, at the moment, appeals against original decisions seem to us to be a bit of a free good. In other words, effectively, if you're an applicant, actually it doesn't really cost you very much to make an appeal. And we think the bar for an appeal ought to be slightly higher. We would suggest perhaps a couple of ways in which that bar might be raised. The first would be, if you're seeking to overturn the initial decision of a public body, you should at least be able to be required to demonstrate, A, why you think the public body is wrong, but also, secondly, you should be required to demonstrate why that information is actually needed in the public interest. You will note we've not talked about charging, but we would suggest perhaps, and it's slightly surprising to us that it hasn't come up so far, that you perhaps might consider charging for an appeal. And what we mean by that is we recognise why the bar should be low to make the initial FOI Act request, but if the public body has rejected it, it doesn't seem to us unreasonable to say to somebody, we are going to make the bar a little bit higher, so you really have to consider about making an appeal. So if you make an appeal, you have to send in, at the same time as you make the request, a reasonable fee. And I think our view would be that, to keep us honest, perhaps that fee should be refundable if actually the applicant in the appeal wins that appeal and it's proved that we were wrong in rejecting in the first place. So those for us would be 3 ways in which we think this disproportionate burden could be reduced.
Here to, in a sense, appeals to the Commissioner, or are you talking about when it goes beyond
well, I
the
think
Commissioner?
I think our argument would be going back, it's further back in the process, which is that initial request to reconsider, and then
also the internal review.
The internal review, and then when it also goes to the Commissioner, you might consider, I mean, and again, there'll be a debate about the point at which of those two you should charge and what the charge should be, but I think there's an argument we would have that at the moment that bar is kind of too low. Just as a final point, we genuinely think this has got worse, significantly worse, over the last 3 to 4 years, and we obviously looked back with some interest at the Justice Select Committee's, post-legislative scrutiny when it did it, but we think there has been a significant change, and we therefore think that in terms of the timing of this commission, it feels to us particularly well timed to address what is a considerable issue for our members. I hope that's helpful.
Mr. Hopson, do you know how many FOI requests your 238 trusts and other bodies receive each year?
No, I don't.
And is any effort made to collate this information?
No, individual trusts will do it on an individual basis, and I think you've got some evidence from, I think, one of our members at King's College that effectively shows you how many they've received. I would just make the observation that the £300,000 it costs them each year to do this is the equivalent to 14 full-time, fully qualified nurses. So their view is that this is taking a considerable amount of resource off the front line.
But measuring the burdens is obviously important, but a key element of the measuring the burden is the number of requests. Would it not be a good idea if there was a standard system for both collecting and reporting on FOI requests in the NHS sector?
Yes, I mean, I'm certainly, there would clearly be, it would be lovely to come here with a complete set of kind of quantitative and qualitative data to support my argument. Okay. I would just note, though, again, paragraph 56 of the Information Commissioner's written evidence, where he says this is a difficult question to resolve by reference to quantitative data alone. So in other words, I think his argument is there have been a number of different studies showing quantitatively what the burden is, and even if we were to kind of collect that data, I think his argument would be it wouldn't be conclusive about whether it might support our argument or the argument of those who...
It wouldn't be conclusive, for sure, but it seems to me getting the quantitative data is essential in any event.
Yes.
And the evidence we've received shows that there is a wide variation of practice within the public sector as a whole about between those who do collect data routinely and then coordinate that data and those who don't.
I mean, so just to make one point, it may well be that we haven't got it. So, I mean, certainly all the evidence that I've gathered as I've prepared for today's session suggests to me that individual trusts do have a completely specific record of how many they're dealing with. It's just they haven't filed those numbers with us.
Okay, and it may be that they're not on a consistent basis either, and that would probably be helpful. You obviously have got a written crib there, Mr. Hopson. Would it be okay to let us have it?
It's various scribbled notes, but I'm very happy to give you a note that sets out what I just said. Yes, of course I would.
Just running through the 5 of the 6 categories that you mentioned. The first was commercial companies looking for names for marketing material.
Yeah.
But am I not right in thinking that in most cases, not necessarily all, individual names will have been redacted in any event because they would be protected under data protection legislation?
Well, so clearly what needs to... So what a request will come in at is will give us the names of effectively below board level, which is quite often where a lot of our kind of key commercial decisions are made. Give us the name of all of your heads of anybody who spends money. Now, clearly every single trust and foundation trust has to have their board names on the website, but it doesn't have their heads of names. So our guys have then got to do, they'll probably ask for, give us, your top 3 management tiers right the way across, all names and all contact details, and that clearly takes a long time to collect.
Why don't you have that information anyway? Because it will be available on an intranet, an internal one. Why isn't it just available?
Because our view would be that it is appropriate to have board level names in the public domain, but it's not appropriate to have significant kind of levels down, particularly because what then happens is they get caught up in mass marketing campaigns of people who then send them acres of material, particularly if you're the head of IT, that, to be frank, is not necessary.
But if I were to go on the website of a local authority with which I'm very familiar, I'm pretty certain, this is Blackburn with Darwin, that virtually every level is known on the website anyway, and people know who they are. So I simply don't follow. This must be information that should be in the public domain, isn't it? About who is working, doing what job.
So the only information that needs to be put in the public domain is who the board directors are.
No, I understand about. Well, this is your argument, but I'm leave us. Forget about the word appropriate, which means a million things. Just explain to me how it is not in the public interest to deny the public information about people working at a senior level, below board level, and at a middle ranking level, and at a junior level in an area of the public service.
So there's a debate about how much time and effort it takes to, in an organisation of 8,000 people, which is probably your average trust size, of which you've probably got a middle management tier of, let's say, 400 or 500 people, which is probably turning over 20-25% a year, the time that it takes to effectively collect all of that information with contact details. It's not just names and posts, it's also telephone numbers and emails that we often get asked for, and the needs to keep that constantly up to date.
But will it not be on... Well, any self-respecting organisation will be running an internal intranet where this will be there anyway.
So if you then go to the civil service, I was a civil servant in HMRC as a board level director for 7 years, what you'll see is that most of the civil servants have chosen for perfectly good reasons to not have their names and details put into the public domain for precisely some of these reasons.
What I'm trying to establish here, because it seems to be really important, that this information, which you say is quite costly to produce, will be available. It has to be on the internal intranet.
It may not.
Well, how on earth, even in HMRC, will somebody know who to talk to if this particular officer has decided to withdraw their name from the intranet?
Because there's a difference between what is declared internally
I understand about that. But
cost of collection.
I'm talking about the cost of collection. So I'm just trying to pin down, is this information easily available to the organisation? And the organisation, frankly, could not run unless the information was available. We agreed about that.
It depends upon the nature of the information that's being asked for.
No, I'm talking about names of people.
Well, and what I'm saying is it partly depends upon what cut of that information the individual FOI request has asked for. Because sometimes what you get is a particular, horizontal, vertical slice through a particular department, as opposed to the simple list where you can, asking for every single head of.
Okay, all right,
so all I'm trying to say is that, it really isn't, is quite as simple as just grab it off the intranet and then put it on.
Okay, well, at least we accept that this information should be available on an intranet. Otherwise, the organisation has got some really serious problems. I'd also be grateful if we could have a note about what the argument is for withholding this information about what jobs people are doing. I'm afraid I simply do not understand the argument. And if the information was available, it would save your members an awful lot of work.
Well, so for example, you are a doctor who is running the gastroenterology department of a hospital. If that name was to be in the public domain on the website, you are likely to invite a very large amount of direct communication direct to that individual that, to be frank, will take that individual away from their core job.
But sorry, it's on public websites.
Well, so,
if you want to know the head of the gastroenterology department, it's on the website. But if you want to know the name of the head of procurement, because you happen to think your company can sell better, cheaper surgical instruments, you can't find the name of the head of procurement on the website. How can you possibly justify that distinction?
Well, all I'm saying is that if you look at the requests that our members are receiving to go right the way across an entire middle management tier, what you will find is the amount of time that it takes them to produce that information. Again, let me put it in a note, and I'll explain as you've asked the argument as to why.
Just to say that, to follow up with Lord Carlisle's point, I mean, in a big village like Blackburn, everybody knew anyway who was in charge of gastroenterology, probably who was in charge of procurement. So I simply and certainly in the local authority, all the way down, including in the commercially sensitive departments like planning, who was the case officer?
Well, so the issue isn't people from the village of Blackburn making the FOI request. It's the commercial company in London who basically wants to create a mailing list that they can then sell to a third party of all of the lists of head of gastroenterology procurement right the way across all 151 acute hospitals.
I still don't assuming you have a properly regulated procurement system, I still don't understand.
Well, that's
well, I'm going to just finish. I still don't understand why that information should be denied to. So people in Blackburn should have it, but not people in London. I don't follow that. Can we? Let me go on to ask you about the complainants. In my experience of having seen a lot of NHS complaints. Almost all relevant, say, internal emails will have to have been disclosed, both for the internal process and then if there's, it goes before an employment tribunal. So what additional information is sought and how much of this is a burden?
So the point I think we're kind of trying to make here is that it seems to us perfectly reasonable for people to make FOI requests to gather information in order to make their complaint so that they can effectively work out exactly the areas in which that complaint should be focused. The argument I think we're making here is that once that has gone through due process and has been adjudicated on, usually either inside the hospital or, if necessary, through referral to the Ombudsman, the argument I think we're making here is that what we're then experiencing is a number of people, even though a determination has been made of that complaint by the appropriate authority, they're coming back again and making a whole series of requests. And again, I think we need to be careful here because I think we all understand there are people for whom some traumatic incidents may have occurred and who therefore they will be seeking to kind of understand. But if you, and I can give you some kind of examples. There's one trust here that's required arrangements for medical record transfers pre-2000, every single operational policy change from 1980 to date, GMC numbers of staff from the 1980s, security arrangements then and now including lock fittings. In other words, and this is a person with whom has gone through a complaint, has had that complaint adjudicated on, but they now kind of want to go back and collect vast amounts of extra information because, to be frank, they weren't particularly happy with with the result of the way the complaint was adjudicated on. So that's the point I'm kind of trying to make. It's a relatively narrow one. It's not about all complainants. It's about once the complaint process has been completed and adjudicated on.
Okay. My last question, before passing on to other colleagues, is about appeals. You talked about having a higher bar, and this is my language, not yours, about introducing a system which, say, for example, does apply in employment tribunals where there is an initial fee, but you're suggesting that should be returned. Could we park that for a moment? Have you got any views about whether the process of appeals to the first tier tribunal and then to the upper tier tribunal could itself be simplified or streamlined?
Well, I think a number of people have given you evidence that effectively we seem to have this process of too many layers. So in other words, you make the request, it's denied, there's an internal review, there's an internal to the Information Commissioner, first tier, second tier. 4 tiers seems to us to be excessive. There are relatively few cases, clearly, in our part of the world that have gone right the way up the top, but there have been plenty of cases that have obviously gone through each of those lower tiers, and our members tell us it's not just the processing of the initial request that is forming the burden, it's actually the amount of preparation time that is needed to A, go through the internal review, and then B, if it goes to the FOI Commissioner, the amount of kind of management time that takes. And I think, again, people would make the distinction between perfectly legitimate, ordinary, requests from ordinary members of the public, and then people who are, to be frank, of the kind of people that I've highlighted as being, perhaps inappropriate cases. the observation our members make is very large numbers of those people do want to go through that route in terms of doing the internal review and then going to the Information Commissioner, because they basically feel that there is, no loss. It's a free good for them to do so. So I think the point our members are making is, look, of course, perfectly entitled if a genuine request, somebody thinks that we've kind of turned it down. But why are people who are trying to end run round procurement processes, why are frivolous requests able to kind of go through relatively, at a very, as a free good to both those first kind of next two tiers up?
Yep, thank you.
How well prepared and trained do you think your people are at dealing with the various exemptions that are available under the Act? I mean, is there a tendency to say these are just too complicated, we might as well try to give the information? Because in many cases, and we've been through quite a number this morning with various witnesses, and you mentioned the one about vexatious requests where there are differences of views about how difficult it is to use that. But on the commercial side, I mean, it seems to me that there is a tendency to imply that all commercial requests are invalid, whereas, as we know, I mean, commercial requests can play quite an important part in improving competition within any public authority. And fishing trips, which are called fishing trips, I mean, well, all kinds of auditors use fishing trips in different ways to try to establish whether there may be things that have gone wrong. It doesn't seem to me that makes it invalid.
So a number of different questions there. Let me just take the last one first, which is, I've got sitting in front of me 3 examples from a telecoms provider, an ICT provider, and would you believe a greengrocer, who basically were all effectively seeking to do end-run round procurement processes.
What do you mean by end run around a procurement process?
So trusts basically procure goods through a public procurement process. They're required to do so under the EU and UK procurement regulations. Yes. They will go through a process of drawing up a tender document and issuing that tender document, and then people can bid against it. So what our members have is, and here's an example of 35 different bits of information that a telecoms provider is seeking, about 70 different items of information that an ICT person is...
Right, but that seems to me to be an issue about quantity in the way that it is done, rather than the principle of
no,
this.
Our argument would be that people who wish to sell items to our members should go through the proper procurement processes that are set out to do that. And just as you have schemes of publication for corporate information, effectively that information is kind of provided through the procurement process. So the greengrocer wants to know how many boxes and bags of fresh fruit and vegetable and a breakdown of what those items were. How many pieces of fruit this would generally represent per box, e.g. 100 bananas per box. How many tins of fruit and bags of frozen vegetables and the total cost. How many cakes, packs of biscuits, cake bars, sweet puddings and dessert pies and the total cost. And all our members are saying is, okay, if that person wishes to supply those goods to us, go through the procurement process and get the tender document that will set out exactly what's required, but stop coming to us with FOI requests that have got huge, large numbers of items in them as a means of seeking that information. And that's why I think we're suggesting to you that if we could have a statutory code, which we would perhaps have an opportunity to contribute into, and no doubt my opposite number in the Society of IT Suppliers would also sit round the table, we could have an agreement about what was vexatious and what wasn't, rather than leaving it as we do at the moment for our guys to make a judgment based on the guidance and then have that challenged and then quite often appealed.
This is a procedural question. Given that tens of thousands of people responded to our call for evidence, and NHS providers did not, could you please let us have your 6 initial points with cogent and brief reasons by the end of this week?
Yes, we could.
Thank you.
Final question.
Can I just say, I'm sorry we didn't give you initial evidence. To be frank, we weren't aware that the inquiry was going on. And we weren't written to ask to provide evidence. Had we been so, we would have provided evidence.
Well, I'm sorry about that.
No, that's fine, that's fine. I just want to make the point
although
that, and having been
I have to say, I have found since the inquiry was established that it was very difficult to get away from any newspaper that wasn't carrying a story about what a wicked creation it was. But finally, when your members answer questions, do they publish the questions and answers as a matter of course in all cases, or are they selective about how much they publish?
Let me just look behind me and check. Okay, so the answer we think is that most of the time they would publish that information. But
so the greengrocers, the answer the greengrocer gets,
to be frank, I don't know whether actually this was rejected as, I don't know what the answer was. All I've got is the example of the question. But the only reasons, the grounds we would withhold would be due to be frank, the personal nature kind of the question. So if an individual were to ask for details concerning their particular case, for example, then that is clearly not something that we would choose to ordinarily put in the public domain.
Well, I thought this was public information rather than private information.
Again, clearly, if it's a matter of sensitive information that an individual patient has asked for, I think you would expect our members to be really quite careful about what they do and don't put in the public domain.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It's been very helpful, and your opening remarks and things which set out very clearly the things you're concerned about and some of your remedies, it's very useful for us to have.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for your evidence. As I've been asking other witnesses, would you like to make any opening statements, or for us just to go straight into questions?
Well, very briefly, from a local authority perspective, we welcome the work of the Commission, and we're grateful for the opportunity of contributing to the work. And our response, as you've read it, is an attempt by us to capture some of the practical experiences we've had ever since the introduction of the Freedom of Information legislation, to reflect some of our learning and hopefully offer some constructive ideas about how we can maintain the transparency, accountability and efficiency that the legislation brings, whilst also tempering it with some practical measures to improve its performance, reduce the burdens on the authorities, and enhance the experience of those requesting information to access it as effectively as possible.
Thank you very much. Michael.
Thank you both very much. Thank you for your evidence, which was very helpful. And as you know, we've already heard today from the Local Government Association. You say that you've only used Section 36 to protect information on 42 occasions. Can you give us some idea of how many of the 15,495 cases which you say you've been involved with could potentially have fallen within Section 36?
Well, we find it's quite a difficult exemption to actually apply. And very often, sometimes, there are other exemptions that are perhaps easier to apply to the information. The few occasions that we have used it, obviously, it requires the decision of the appropriate officer, which is Mr. Wilde, and obviously he takes great consideration when deliberating whether the information should be released or not, and therefore he's very often decided that it's not appropriate to exempt that information. So, and we've relied on maybe other exemptions, or have looked more seriously at what information can be released and just applied a different exemption to more limited information. But it's a very difficult exemption to apply, and perhaps if other members of the authority could apply that exemption, which would then allow Geoff, in his capacity of the Director of Law and Governance, to review that decision, maybe it would have been used more often.
Well, I realise you say that it's very difficult. What I'm after, if you can help us on that, is how many of the large number of requests you say you've received, how many could have fallen, in your judgment, roughly speaking, within Section 36, as opposed to the 42 occasions when you did use Section 36? I'm trying to
42
get a sense of
is a correct reflection of the proportion of the total number of requests where Section 36 could have applied. I think in all the others, Section 36 has never been raised as a potential exemption. It's very, very seldom used or even requested.
But if I take that answer at face value, you're saying you used Section 36 on every occasion you could have used it.
On most occasions, that is correct, because by the time the Section 36 exemption has been proffered and considered, other exemptions would have been put forward first. Or, alternatively, ways in which the information could be disclosed have been considered first. So it is very much an exemption of last resort.
And you say that, that it should be easier to use Section 36, although you're content that it is a qualified exemption. Are you seeking legislative change, or do you think guidance, different and clearer guidance, would suffice to meet your concerns?
From my perspective, and I'll leave Mrs. Dodge to express her view, but my perspective is that guidance on a number of the exemptions and where they can and cannot be used would be helpful, and that is probably the extent of what is required at this stage.
And I personally think that it would be preferable if the appropriate designated officer that could invoke that decision perhaps could be widened to more than, in our authority, just Geoff. I think because also as Geoff is the Director of Law and Governance, when we have had challenges when we have used Section 36, the only people that have got sufficient knowledge of the Act really to do an independent review are, like myself, subordinate to Geoff, which automatically puts you in a slightly difficult position. So maybe if you could broaden who are the designated officers, that would allow Geoff, in his position and experience, to have the overall say-so should it come up for review.
So
it's only a suggestion.
You want to keep the qualified person provision, but change the...
But maybe extend the number of people that are qualified to invoke it, or anybody could invoke it, and then the qualified person would be there to review it.
Yes. And so you're not suggesting, as I thought you might have been reading your evidence, that Section 35 should be widened to use to enable other public bodies such as yours to use it?
No, we didn't consider Section 35 at all because we just deemed it wasn't appropriate to local government. So.
Right. Now, you also argue for an absolute exemption on issues to do with the security of the council's networks, systems, etc., is how you put it. Have you had many or any requests on issues of that kind? And if so, how have they been treated? Have they been granted?
Well, we certainly have. One of the biggest concerns from an IT point of view, we've had dozens of requests in the last year for information about what security we have on our, like our infrastructure, our networks, like what providers do we use, what virus protection do we have, and that kind of thing. And individual requests on their own maybe seem quite innocuous, and you give the information out. And then over a period of 6 months, you can actually see a trend. And if all the information that was asked was then, say, one person had overarching sight of that and put it all together, they obviously, if they found out what measures we were putting in place to stop being spammed and hacked and have Trojans and all of that sort of thing, telling people what we do to stop that is just going to give them a foot in to our networks and compromise our information, isn't it? So, I think
have you had that series of requests which amounted to...
Yes, we have, and our head of ICT actually raised concerns, which I did put in the report, about the sort of aggregation of piecemeal bits of information to different individuals, which collectively could be quite compromising.
And what happened? Did you refuse the request, or did you give all the information?
No, we're starting to refuse them from now, or we're starting to...
Using which,
we haven't...
which exemption?
Well, we'll be using section 31. That's the only vaguely appropriate exemption. And as I said, this is one of the reasons why we perhaps want a separate exemption to be brought in, or maybe perhaps an extension to the existing exemption. I'm not saying it needs to be absolute, it could be qualified, but I think there needs to be some sort of provision where local authorities can protect their assets, both their networks and their properties and things like that.
And that would obviously require legislation. You couldn't do that by guidance.
Well, you couldn't really, no. You'd have to sort of broaden the scope of section 31.
And have any of the attempts that you've made to protect this information so far gone to the Commissioner, or not yet?
Well, not recently, no. We haven't had anything recently go to the Information Commissioner at all, but we have had various sort of hacks on our network, and I think at the last couple of weeks we've had over 3,000 attempts at people trying to hack into KCC security network. This is an ongoing problem. You
can't directly link it to the request
no,
for information.
we absolutely can't, and we appreciate that. But all we're saying is that, you have to give some consideration. You can't make absolutely all information available to everybody all the time. There are going to be repercussions if you do. So.
Right. Well, thank you for that. Now, you also suggest that the vexatious provision should be widened. And so I want to ask you, first of all, whether you think that should be done statutorily or by guidance. You do identify a number of ways in which it could be done, but not the question of statutory or by guidance. And I'd like to know how often you have used the vexatious provisions to refuse requests.
We don't use it very often at all because, to be perfectly honest, when we receive requests, so we've had things like how many people are employed at the council called Dave and other such interesting things, it's actually easier just to deal with the request than it is to refuse it, because when you refuse it, people assume that you're calling them vexatious, not the request. That's a perception, I know. But they get very aggrieved about it, quite obviously. They then complain, and the time it takes to deal with the complaint actually is more time consuming and costly in resources than to actually just attempt to answer the request in the first place. So one of the reasons why we don't use it that often is just because sometimes it's simpler, cheaper, and less.
Have you actually had a request for the number of people in the authority called
We
Dave?
certainly have, but they didn't ask how many people were in the authority or how many were men and women. So when we gave them the answer, which was I think 129 off the top of my head, it didn't really mean much.
Can you give us some other examples of a similar kind?
How many red pens has Kent County Council used?
How many?
How many red pens has Kent County Council used? We have over 10,000 employees. It's quite a lot, but we don't have to break down, obviously, our stationery to that level of detail, so it's an impossible question to answer.
The first one about the number of people called Dave, presumably that was not burdensome, whereas the one about the red pens was burdensome.
Well, the one with Dave was very easy to answer because it was
Yes,
just a case of going
exactly.
into the HR system and pulling a list of everyone called Dave or David. So
you gave them Davids as well as Dave.
See, you get a lot from Kent County Council. Value for money.
But this is one of the points we were trying to draw out in our response at 618, was that these trivial time-wasting complaints, as compared with some of the real meritorious and valued requests that we receive, and whether there's a way to distinguish, and I appreciate it's very hard to legislate for that sort of distinction, but it would be extremely useful if we could discard some of these more trivial and insignificant requests from those which really deserve time and attention.
But don't most of the suggestions you make actually run up against other aspects of the of the legislation, or would be easily circumvented by people.
Well, I think that's the point I made about fees. Yes, it would be nice to charge people that are going to make commercial gain from the information that we've collated for them, but I appreciate it's sort of unenforceable because people would just then make requests using their personal emails. So I don't know what the solution is, but I'm just giving you feedback of how we find it as a local authority.
Well, that brings me to the last question I wanted to ask you, which was about these requests for information on a commercial motive rather than what you would possibly regard as a public interest motive. And my question is this: if requests of that kind enable someone to put in a bid for one of your services on a more competitive or a more effective basis, that is, in a sense, in the public interest, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And our contractual information, the major contracts that we have in place, are routinely published. There's an element that people don't want to bother to look for that information, rightly or wrongly, and maybe we should do something more about that.
Can't you just tell them that it's already available?
Yeah. But either way, even if it's already available, someone has put the request in, and myself and a member of my team still have to go through the motions of answering it, acknowledging it, pointing them in the direction where they can find that information. That all takes time, and collectively that amount of time could arguably be used on frontline services like getting rid of one of my team and employing a social worker. That's really what it's all about. Local authorities, KCC's no exception, we're under a lot of budgetary constraints. I think we've got to save 80 million next year and generate another 19 million in revenue, and obviously any money that can be saved by any means whatsoever to go to frontline services is surely a good thing, and that's in the public interest too, along with the information. So,
thank you very much.
Could I ask, do you routinely publish the answers to all of the requests that you answer on your internet site?
We do have a disclosure log on our website that gives details of the number of requests, not who it was from, but a general description of the request, whether we withheld it or not, and how many times we took to deal. Unfortunately, we log our requests on a Microsoft Access database, which is quite low tech, and we haven't got the provisions to redact the sort of 15,000 answers that we've given and upload them to the website, because we'd need another couple more employees to do that, and we haven't got the budget to employ them. So until we get a more sort of better technology, if you like. But saying that, we do say on our website with our disclosure log that if anybody wants a copy of the request and our response to it, we'll gladly give it out, but we do it on a as we need to basis, rather than use resources we haven't got, making information publicly available just in case someone wants to look at it.
Any other questions? Thank you very much. And thank you for your evidence. That's very helpful. Just to make clear that you are not both from the same organisation, but that you are from separate organisations, and because we thought that many of the points that we might want to raise with you would be common, that it would be helpful, in a sense, to seat you side by side so that we can hear your answers sequentially. Do either of you want to make, or both of you, make an opening statement?
If I can just be very brief, and very happy to be sitting alongside my colleague, as we work very closely with all other media organisations, some of whom you've heard from, and in great detail. the Society of Editors has about 400 members across the whole of the media, so we've got a fair amount of evidence, much of it anecdotal, of course, from across the media. Our basic concern has been that any review of this kind should be more about trying to make sure that the way forward for FOI, which we believe quite clearly the evidence shows has worked very well on behalf of the public, and I believe actually on behalf of public authorities. Certainly when I sat on an information users group within the Ministry of Justice, we had very similar questions to being raised now, and points which are being raised now about the burden and so on. And that was dealt with. What we found at that time was that when in discussion, many people from the health service, from local government, from the police, actually realised that it could be of an advantage to them to release more information. And the problem was that there was the culture in the past had been that very little information was released, but if you released a lot more information, you got a lot fewer questions, actually. And I think that's the position we're at now. I think that there are certain areas where FOI needs to be extended, certainly into the area where there are organisations which are acting on behalf of government and other public authorities. And I came in earlier on when you were having evidence from a university. I mean, a university spends an awful lot of public money, and it's dear to everyone's hearts. And the idea that they should be taken out of it just seems to be quite wrong. We already accept that there are plenty of areas of, and understand why there are areas where FOI shouldn't apply, for instance, to do with individual privacy and commercial confidentiality and so on. Going on to the burden, I do understand some of the points which are made there, but we get from our members the view that quite often some authorities, whether it's local authorities or and the police, have in fact increased their own burden by in fact saying instead of just answering a journalist's query through the press office, they've actually put in a freedom of information request when it could actually be easily dealt with just answering the question. There was one police authority, police force actually, which actually said we're in competition with the media. We want to get our information onto our website before the papers and the telly and so on. And I said, well, of course you do, but I'm not sure the public will see it as being totally independent information. And I think also, if you look at the cost of public relations across the public sector, it's huge compared to the cost which anyone can identify for answering freedom of information requests. And at one point, I seem to remember that the Press Gazette, the trade paper, did actually do a survey about the number of people in government and public sector press offices, and I think that almost every journalist had a personal press officer, and so there's a huge cost there already. But I think really what it comes down to, our view...
But aren't most of those answering questions from journalists?
Sorry?
I mean, aren't most of them answering questions from journalists anyway?
Well,
I mean,
perhaps...
most of the press officers I've worked with spent most of their time...
Or perhaps creating pieces of
every now and again
information
every now and again they might do that, but the bulk of their time was actually...
Well, certainly, yeah. But I mean, it's a huge. The point is, there's a huge investment in public relations compared to the cost of FOI.
Well, I prefer to think of it as a cost in answering journalists' questions.
Yeah. Anyway, if I could just to conclude by saying that really our basic point is to try to change the outlook. I think that was Parliament's intent originally, and where in some organisations, the switch is in the wrong place still. Instead of it's tell them as little as possible until you are absolutely forced to tell them something, when in fact it would be better to set the default switch to tell people everything unless there is a very good reason for not doing it. And I understand, and I think we all accept that there are very good reasons to understand it. And the final point I would make is that you'll hear later on from Maurice Frankel from the Campaign for Freedom of Information. It seems strange that after 10 years of the Act being in position and 15 years after it being passed through Parliament, we still have to have a Campaign for Freedom of Information. That is an indictment of itself.
We'll let him answer that question himself.
Good afternoon. I'm Peter Clifton. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the Press Association, or PA as it's widely known. We're the national news agency of the UK and Ireland. We provide hundreds of news reports, pictures, videos and graphics to customers in this country and abroad, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The customer base is very broad, covering all the main UK broadcasters, national and regional newspapers and an enormous range of websites. PA is a passionate supporter of the Freedom of Information Act and has regularly used it in a responsible way to provide insightful journalism to our many customers. Journalism that has on occasion been raised in Parliament, prompted reviews of CPS guidelines and highlighted gaps in the understanding of important data. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to be here with Bob today, but I'm also keen to stress that we're here to represent a united view across the UK media. PA shares the widely aired concerns about the makeup of the Commission and regrets the lack of anyone representing the media industry and investigative journalism, bringing a more positive view of some of the many benefits the FOI Act has delivered to increase transparency around government and public bodies. We also believe the questions the Commission is considering, predominantly around the burden and the controls of the FOI Act, suggest a remit based on reining in the Act rather than looking at how it could be further strengthened to support the government's commitment to greater transparency. On costs, we hear concerns about the money spent on meeting FOI requests, and yet close examination of the numbers would suggest they are microscopic amounts of money compared to overall budgets, fractions of 1% for government and councils. This does not seem like a high price to pay. This is, after all, public money that is being spent to give the public greater transparency around the institutions they are paying for. And of course, the amount spent on FOI requests are significantly less than government and council spend on their own PR and official communication channels. On the other hand, there has been a suggestion that the public, charities and media should be charged for making FOI requests. Hardly a great calling card for openness, and at a stroke, numerous important investigations will be strangled at birth. Many of the PA's most telling FOI reports involve multiple requests. For example, asking the UK's 45 police forces how many registered sex offenders they have lost trace of. The answer was a startling 396, some for more than a decade, but an answer that may never have been revealed had it cost more than £1,000 to make such a multiple request. Our overarching view, and one shared by the Information Commissioner, is that the FOI process works. Sections 35 and 36 of the Act already provide adequate safeguards. Vexatious inquiries can be blocked, and the safe space so beloved of Cabinet Ministers and their advisers is most often upheld by the Information Commissioner. There seems a clear lack of evidence that there may have been any chilling effect on civil servants in their dealings with ministers, but many, including the Information Commissioner, the Justice Select Committee and the former head of the Civil Service, have rejected this notion. It is our view that the FOI Act has provided invaluable support for an open democracy over the past decade, and far from clipping its wings, the remit of the Act should be extended to include private contractors like G4S, Serco and Capita, who receive billions of pounds of public money every year and should surely be subject to greater scrutiny. The final point is about the public. Millions of them read the FOI-based reports written by PA and many other media organisations. They provide billions of pounds every year to fund our government and councils. If you took the time to gather their views on this vital democratic issue, it is hard to imagine any member of the public supporting further controls on access to information that should very often already be in the public domain. If we are genuinely striving to have the most transparent government in the world, our institutions should be readily making more data available where openness is the default, not secrecy, and underpinned by a strong, responsibly run FI Act of which we can all be proud. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I start, Mr. Satchwell, with page 2 of the Society of Editors' evidence?
Yep.
Because there's something I don't quite understand there. You say in the middle of the page, the pursuit of a safe space for decision-making is misguided and unnecessary. It's misguided because if applied through the use of a blanket exemption, it would pull down the shutters on the transparency that the Government and Parliament has pledged to encourage. It's unnecessary because sufficient exemptions and protections already exist to safeguard sensitive discussions in the formulation of policy. There seems to me to be an internal contradiction in those two paragraphs. So can I start by asking you to be clear as to whether you believe that there should be some space, safe space for decision making?
I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, it's partly to do with timing. I think that if you look at any major policy decision which has been made by government, as time goes by, it becomes less important to protect it.
Hence the switch from the 30-year rule to the 20-year rule, for example. But if that is right, why do you describe it as misguided and unnecessary?
I think what we were looking at, that we're probably saying there, is that the idea of increasing the ability of government to withhold that kind of information. I also have a view that when we heard from the previous head of the civil service who said there was no sort of chilling effect on civil servants, which was one of the arguments that was put up.
I don't think that's quite what he said. But first of all, can I thank you for an important clarification in answer to the first part of my question? I was going to refer to Lord O'Donnell. So can we just remind you that we heard from the Information Commissioner last week who said something similar to what you just said, but we also heard from Lord O'Donnell that there is uncertainty that the Act brings. Do you accept that the Act does leave some uncertainty as to what will be released or withheld? And if so, would you favour the introduction of greater clarity, at least by guidelines or practice notes?
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent it's a matter of common sense a lot of the time, and I think again it comes back to this point that people at the highest levels of government, just as the point I was making about local government or the health service or whatever, is that in fact it is a value for people at the highest level of government to release as much detail as possible about how decisions are made and why they've been made, because that actually increases public confidence and so on. And I think too often there is a concern about whether it's political embarrassment or whatever. And, okay, we live in the real world, and so, I think the more that can be released at an earliest possible time, the better. And I think that the other point is that I mean, again, I think some of the view I seem to be getting from the idea I was taking from the civil service arguments is that, oh well, it's difficult for us to be put on the line if our advice to ministers is released. Well, I would have thought if well-paid and highly qualified civil servants are giving the best advice, it's quite a good discipline to know that eventually your advice is going to be might well be released.
You both.
Sorry, isn't that just all about the word eventually?
well,
I
yes.
mean, it's the when is eventually.
Well, I think in a sense it comes down to some of the tests you might apply to commercial sensitivity if negotiations are going on. I mean, I think it would be foolish to suggest that while government is coming to a decision about something, and while the cabinet is still debating something and no decision has been made, I mean, that has a sort of the equivalent of sort of commercial sensitivity about it, doesn't it?
Can I just press you on this point? Because it's a subtle issue, the relationship between ministers and their officials. But both sides have to put up with the fact that the other side has not chosen them. So it's not... of course, you know, so it's not like in a sort of command and control organisation where probably Mr Clifton has some control over who works inside his organisation. So you've got ministers who are appointed by the Prime Minister. You come into a department, it's a fundamental part of our constitution that you accept the fact that there is going to be a body of permanent civil servants you won't necessarily have had any control over, whose political opinions about which you ought to know nothing, but whose duty is to be loyal to the government of the day. But this is based on this issue of trust and confidence, which then runs in, subtly, to this issue of confidentiality for a period, whilst these people are speaking truth to power. So, Mr Satchwell, would you not accept that this very important constitutional arrangement we have, permanent civil service, politically appointed ministers, does necessitate some protection for that bond of trust between official and minister?
Well, of course, I can accept that is important, and that is in the public interest itself. But the point I'm making, I think, is that there's a greater public interest in informing the public about how a decision has been made at the earliest opportunity, and I think that actually would enhance that relationship of trust and the way that government works if you do it on that basis. But you beg the question
of what's the earliest opportunity?
Well, of course it does, yes. But, I mean, as I say, what I said in the conclusion to my opening remarks is that it's a matter of trying to get the default switch into a different place. And it's saying, instead of releasing it only when you've got to, and when it's dragged out of a public authority or government, well, you know, the assumption should be release it and have unless there's a very good reason for not doing so, and to think about what those reasons are. And I'm sure that those of you who've sat in those positions know precisely what they are, and it shouldn't obviously just be a matter of convenience or embarrassment.
A practical question that arises, I think, from what Mr Straw has just said. Between your organisations, you represent the whole of the British press, effectively, more or less. And we know that the PA's stories come from every corner of the country and find their way into the newspapers that your editors edit. To what extent has there actually been discussion about the evolution of FOI between your representative organisations and ministers or the Cabinet Secretary over the years since it came into effect? Because I must say it does seem to me that we would have less megaphoning about the work of this Commission and FOI in general if we could be confident that there were creative discussions taking place on a regular basis between you and government.
Well, over the years, over the whole period, and in fact before the Act was introduced, and working very closely with the Campaign for Freedom of Information, and as I say, after it was passed, I mean, I actually sat on a government committee which did a very similar review.
Has that continued?
But it hasn't continued, no.
Is it your view that there should be a review committee or something of that kind which would ensure that there was an ongoing conversation between government and interested parties, including Mr Frankel's organisation, I can be forgiven for putting it so personally, so that less megaphoning takes place and more real discussion?
Well, I think, as I suggested earlier, that everyone benefited. Everyone benefited from that information users group at that time, including the Office of the Information Commissioner, what was exposed was the fact that it was very badly underfunded at that point.
I want to turn now to section 35 and 36, if I may. Mr Clifton, in the PA's evidence, you refer to a number of FOI success stories and indeed you may be quite modest about the number of successful stories there have been. I think we'd accept that. But is it fair to say that very few of those success stories relate to the issue of the operation of sections 35 and 36? And can you tell us in how many cases the request for essentially factual or statistical information was provided without quibble, and that really section 35 and 36 don't act in any way to the detriment of the media?
The one experience we've had of section 36 which jumps to mind was when we recently asked a question of Parliament around any reports that have been written around the provision of alcohol in the Commons and any reports about the health implications of that. And the Speaker blocked that, quoting section 36, and we have no ability to appeal because he has an absolute right to do that. So I would say that's the most. I've only been back at PA for 9 months to a year. That's the only example that I am immediately aware of. I think the vast majority of our examples are where we will go to the police, to a health service, or the ones that you see in prison services, hospital trusts, and there it's more about the reliability of the responses. We very rarely get everybody respond. We will sometimes only get half of them respond. But on occasions, if we get enough of a response, that will be how we set about crafting our story.
What do you do when people don't respond?
Well, we will get back to them and tell them that we are minded to go to the first stage of an appeal. Very often people will then respond and reluctantly give us the information. If we are then at a point where we feel we have sufficient evidence, we will go at that point rather than spend more time going through an individual process with maybe half a dozen of the authorities that we've approached.
How many do you end up with who will have...
the example of the number of prisoners who've been released in error, that was 39 forces out of 45.
Okay, well, quite high.
And that's not a bad strike rate, to be honest, that one.
Are there any changes that you would suggest to sections 35 and 36, or repeals of parts of section 35 or 36?
Well, we'd like to know about the drinking and
Well, we'll have a word with you after.
Yes.
I'll see you in the bar, maybe.
I can't imagine how Mr. Speaker would know about the drinking, for example, by members of the House of Lords in this building, but there we are. Let's move on to something more serious.
What was his reply?
Sorry?
What was his reply, Mr. Speaker?
Well, when we put in essentially we put in a request to ask if there had been any reports gathered around the consumption and the provision of alcohol in the Palace of Westminster, and Mr. Burker rejected it on the basis of section 36 that it would inhibit full and frank discussion, and so we have no response. We were told that there had been 9 people who'd referred themselves for some kind of medical advice, but that was as much as we were told. No, not to him. No, that was as much information as we were given.
Right. Oh, well, leaving that one aside, because the mind boggles after 30-odd years in this place as to what information you would or wouldn't get, can I turn to an entirely different issue, which is the imposition of fees? I don't know if you were here earlier, but you've heard various public authorities, and we've had evidence from various public authorities, protesting, as it were, that the imposition of the FOI is unreasonable for them, and that the media and commercial organisations could perfectly well pay small fees to obtain information. Why isn't that view reasonable?
Well, I think the idea of putting the media into that same category of people just trying to trawl for information, just to make contact, as it was put, to try and offer services or try and get contracts is slightly different. Really, the media is in a different position. We are simply a conduit to the public. And I think also one of the examples that Pete just mentioned about where you're going to 45 different police forces or so many different health authorities, it becomes very, very expensive, even for a major media organisation, perhaps a national paper. It becomes very, very expensive, and there would be there would be cost constraints on that. It's not cheap. What the media, I think, tends to do, though, is again, often with the help of the Campaign for Freedom of Information, is to try and find a way of asking questions in a way which make it easier in a way for any organisation to answer, so that they're not sort of drifting off and having to go off into what are loosely described as fishing expeditions, but to try to be more specific and to be as helpful as possible to say what you want the information for.
What steps do you take to advise your memberships and your journalists that they should not go off on fishing expeditions? Because we have heard evidence and seen evidence that members of the media, particularly the regional media, have an inclination to ask blanket questions of every local authority in their region.
So I'll just point out that although PA provides all the people I described earlier, I wouldn't want any of them to think that I've come here saying I'm representing you in some formal way. I mean, they are our customers. We have great relationships with them. I would say, from my perspective, if you look at the examples that I've quoted here, PA strives to follow up on things that are in the news. It might be a court case that raises an issue, it may be a news story that raises an issue, and you will see the examples that we've quoted, and there are many others, are building on something that we think is legitimately in the public eye, and we think there is a need to find out more information to back up something that's come up as part of the news agenda. And my journalists will be expected to pursue freedom of information requests on that basis, and the idea of fishing trips on a wet Tuesday afternoon because they can't think of anything else to do is absolutely not what I would expect. I expect there to be very good thoughts, and I think that's what people would expect from PA, and the reputation that we have is that we're not going to send out blanket ones about people's first names. We want to follow up and get under the skin of stories that are already in the public eye, and I think the examples that are quoted here and many others I could weigh you down with would point to that. But I would say that there's an awful lot of other fantastic work right at the top of the tree from national newspapers. The Mail did one on public sector pay before Christmas, which actually involved well over 1,000 requests, right down to the Kent Messenger Group in 2009, finding out how many days sick people at Kent County Council had 90,000 days at a cost of £4 million to the local council taxpayer. All of them feel very legitimate to me. I think it's easy to point to the odd example of a crazy one. Crazy stuff happens, but the vast majority of the examples that I'm aware of and read about from the media are responsible.
Sorry,
ones.
just to press the point further, and I mean what I'm about to say. Given that you represent a noble profession underpinned by some ethical principles, does either the Press Association or the Society of Editors issue any guidance of any kind to its membership and customers as to how FOI should be approached?
I routinely refer them to the Campaign for Freedom of Information, actually, to explain how the Act works. And that's been a case from the smallest of local papers to something as big as the BBC. And I've said, go and get advice, because there are people with expertise on the way that the law works, and simply you should have that information from the horse's mouth, as it were.
Mr. Clifton, given the criticism there have been of some journalistic practices, for example, the interception of messages unlawfully, does the PA issue any sort of guidance on the proper use of FOI to its members, and if not, why not? No,
we don't, because that's not our role. I mean, we're a news agency like Reuters or Associated Press. We have a fantastic range of customers who we're delighted to have, who pay us for a service that we provide on a daily basis. That's the nature of our relationship with our customers. We know that they know the high standards that PA will uphold, and the quality of the content we deliver to them will be reflected in their publications on a daily basis, but we certainly wouldn't give advice, because that's not the nature of the association. Is probably a bit of a misnomer. We are a news agency that provides quality content to many customers.
On another matter, is it the view of your bodies that contractors and charities carrying out work for the public sector should be subject to the same obligations as public authorities? And if so, do you set any sort of lower limit so that small companies and small charities are not unduly burdened?
I think the simple answer to that is yes.
Is it yes and yes?
Well, and I can understand the point. I mean, I would leave that to people who have greater knowledge to set where that land might be, and that's as far as I would go. But in principle, we are talking about the major organisations which are now doing public authority work. And I can understand if it is a tiny little local charity or something, there might be difficulties. But that's something which I'm sure that could be worked out at a sensible level.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Mr. Clifton, you say in your evidence that FOI is now being used as a tool to protect those in authority from mere embarrassment. By that, do you mean that ministers or the government is simply seeking to withhold that it considered a policy which might be unpopular, and even that sort of level of consideration should be disclosed? Or do you accept that there are circumstances in which the withholding of information that might prove embarrassing is appropriate?
So my view on that is that I think we're reflecting the fact that there is a tendency for a default more often where withholding information is the preferred route, and that's what concerns us. I think we all acknowledge that there is a requirement for a safe space and a period of time that might elapse before that might no longer be relevant, but I think we're concerned that in various examples that we write about and we see quoted elsewhere, that there is a default which is to try to block that quest for open access to information rather than make that information available.
Yes, in defence of my neighbour, Mr. Straw, who introduced the Freedom of Information Act, wouldn't it be fair to say that when it was introduced, far from seeking a default, the then government was seeking to provide greater openness? If that is the case, and it almost certainly is, what's gone wrong?
Well, I think what's gone wrong is that we see too often that well, I think that at the very heart of what's gone wrong is that we still have a society where there isn't a default of making more information readily available, whether it's on websites of trusts and of health authorities and so on. I think that's at the heart of the issue, that there is an awful lot of information that we shouldn't even be arguing about whether it's in the public domain or not, but it simply isn't, and there'll be reasons, some of which we heard in one of the sessions a bit earlier, about why it's too complicated and expensive to do that. I think if it was the default to do that more readily and to acknowledge that UK taxpayers are fully signed up members of shareholders of UK PLC, more of that information should just be made available. And if it was, we wouldn't then have to go into the often tortuous process to try and get to that information, which really isn't contentious and should just be readily available.
Does it follow from that the publication of A, risk assessments, and B, all responses to requests for FOI would be helpful to the media and you would consider sound principle? That's an easy question, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, there are times, of course, when the release of information as a result of an FOI request is the open release, immediate release, is sometimes used as a way of taking away a media organisation's exclusive. But, I mean, call me cynical, but that seems to happen sometimes.
Can I just follow up the important point Lord Carlisle raised with you about the fact, Mr. Satchwell, you said that you found the user group that was set up initially when the FOI Act had been passed and was coming into force, and regretted the fact that this no longer was there. And drawing that into Mr. Clifton's remarks a moment ago about the need for sort of greater openness, if there were a new user group combining people like yourselves with practitioners, as it were, on the other side, would one of the issues you'd be able to pin down in the notion that, say, health authorities should routinely provide information about staff at every level, or, for example, Mr. Clifton, that police authorities, police forces, should routinely provide information about sex offenders who were from whom contact had been lost sight of. So you ended up with lists of information that should be made available, full stop, and then you would bypass the need for these, what you describe as tortuous and time-consuming applications.
I think, if I could just say this from the outset, I mean, what I've always felt about the Act is that it wasn't powerful enough about its purpose, okay, and what Parliament intended. A real hard purpose clause. And in fact, if you read through it, most of the paperwork is actually how to avoid answering an FOI request and how to get an exemption. And I understand that that's the problem of parliamentary draftsmanship and so on, but that can be a problem in itself. I think that the value of an ongoing dialogue is that you can have conversations about all of these sorts of issues, and you come to an understanding of why something why a health authority may be reluctant to release certain information, or and they may get to understand why journalists might ask difficult questions. And, you know, as I say, certainly in my experience of the user group was that the health authorities, representing the health authorities, local government and the police were actually persuaded that they could benefit from the Act in terms of public confidence.
Yeah. I mean, you just mentioned earlier a potential conflict between the fact that journalists are looking for exclusives, which actually goes against the notion of trying to get everything out ahead of time. But on your point about, if I could just follow up, your point about saying the default position. I mean, when you have been doing these various exercises, which, as you said earlier, by and large did not involve sections 35, 36, I mean, have you run up against problems of getting the information that you wanted? I mean, when you say the default position is not to release the information,
well, I mean,
is that really what is happening?
Well, we would very rarely, and certainly in the time I've been back at PA, I can't recall an instance where we've done an inquiry of all the police forces where we've had them all respond, for example. So there will be some who don't meet the time limit.
Okay, but you haven't had a blanket refusal?
Not from all of them, no. We will normally get a decent body of responses, but some will not. There are some who are more inclined not to reply than others. I've got one other point about the level of information that's made available. I think if more data is made available, there is still a fantastic opportunity for journalists to find stories within that data. So the whole approach to data journalism, which we now embrace, is about really examining figures that are released around hospital tables or exam tables and extracting interesting stories from the data. So it really is lazy journalism if people think, well, just because the data is all out there, there are no exclusives anymore. That's absolutely not the case, and there can be much better quality journalism by proper mining of data that's made available in a more
on a consistent basis.
Yeah, I think it's also true that there has been some change in attitude, and I can think of one in terms of the police. When, 25, 30 years ago, I tried to get to the idea of what's now called crime mapping, to try and tell the public about the levels of crime in their area. I mean, that was seen, I mean, there were technical difficulties at that time, both within IT departments of the police and indeed in the way that newspapers were produced. But that there was a general sort of holdback on it. There is still, to some extent, a holdback on it by the police.
I thought there were apps that would show you the crime in your area now.
Sorry?
I thought there were
That's right.
online.
Yes, I mean, there are. But, I mean, it's that kind of thing where attitudes have been changed by the Act. So, I mean, it's not... That's another reason why it has been effective.
Okay, one more from
me. In paragraph 33 of your evidence, Mr. Clifton, you refer to our next witness, Mr. Grieve, having exercised what you call the divine right of kings to veto the Prince of Wales' Black Spider letters. Doesn't that comment display a complete misunderstanding of the separation of powers? And isn't it a fact that actually the decision of the Supreme Court in that case, insofar as one can distill a decision from it, simply found that Mr. Grieve was carrying out a legitimate task but got it wrong in law? And shouldn't we leave the situation that way rather than extravagantly trying to change the way in which the veto operates?
So I think we were merely pointing out a concern around the executive having the right of veto over a decision of the judiciary.
So exercise the veto earlier then, as was suggested by the Commissioner?
If the veto had been exercised at the right point and it had gone through the process in that order, then that's kind of what the Act is there to do. So I think we're only pointing out there's obviously in very flowery language, there's a danger that if this became the norm, you'd be challenging and vetoing decisions made by the judiciary.
Well, Charles I and Mr. Grieve both lost their heads, didn't they?
Yes.
Thank you. It's clear that FOI has enabled the press to reveal a great deal of information that it was in the public interest to know and which wouldn't have otherwise been revealed. And we've heard a great deal during these sessions and in other evidence about the data that has enabled important stories to be revealed in the health service, police, a range of public authorities. I'd like to go back to the specific issue, Mr. Satchwell, that we were discussing at the beginning of your session about the safe space. And just so that I've understood what it was you were saying, I think you said that the safe space is necessary, that you felt it was fine as it is, and that it shouldn't be extended. Have I captured what you said?
It certainly shouldn't be extended, is what I would say to that. Look, what I was saying is I recognise that just as in that there are occasions, there are times when information, it should be on the similar sort of basis when you think it through. But there should be a positive decision about it. In the sense of saying this is why, this is the important reason why it should not be released. And I think that too often that decisions about releasing any kind of information are negative. Well, the simple answer is no, let's not release it. Whereas in fact, I think what I'm trying to encourage is a positive decision to say the reason why we're not releasing this, there is a very good reason for not releasing it, but the default should be to release it.
Thank you. The Information Commissioner told us last week that his understanding of Sections 35 and 36 had evolved over time. He felt various authorities' understanding had evolved over time, although we have heard evidence that that understanding differs in different places, and that he issued updated guidance and so forth. Do you think greater clarity could be achieved without changing the intention? And if so, how?
Well, I think you can always get greater clarity by reviewing and revising and trying to. I think what it needs to go back to is to keep going back to what the original intention of Parliament was. And as I say, I've always felt that the original intention of Parliament, and this happens too often in legislation, I think, is forgotten, partly because politicians move on by the nature of things, and and I think it's well worth revisiting and saying and sitting round a table and saying, well, where are these boundaries? And
thank you. That's very helpful. May I move on to the speed of the whole process and the layers that we've heard about, characterised by an earlier witness as 4 layers of review. Do you think any of the layers could come out? Would you welcome a more streamlined appeal system?
Well, I've not been directly involved in making FOI requests for some time. In fact, even even since the Act came in, directly involved. But clearly it seems to me that if you've got that many layers, there must be room to streamline. And I think where there's a problem, one of the problems that where we do have an example of a problem that arose with a police force actually, was that they rejected a request, and the Information Commissioner supported the paper that was making the request. And so the police authority changed its reasoning for not releasing the information. I think it went from vexatious to there's an investigation still going on. I think it was that way round. It could have been the other way round, but you know, this is crazy. I mean, you know, it's either there's a very good reason for not releasing that information, or there's not, and that's where there could be greater clarity.
Thank you. I think we have heard a very great deal from yourselves and from other witnesses about the importance of authorities publishing information proactively. And Mr. Clifton, you made a very good case for that. Two questions. The first, I think I know the answer to, but the second, I'd be very interested in your thoughts, and perhaps both your thoughts. Are public bodies complying with their existing obligations for proactive publication? And if not, do you think that someone needs to be given the job of enforcing that? I'll ask Mr. Clifton first.
So I think the answer to the first one is definitely no. It's a very patchwork quilt view of the country currently in terms of the consistency that we get in the data that's released as a matter of routine. I think it would be an excellent thing if there was a more commonly held understanding, an obligation on bodies to behave as they are, publicly owned institutions that make their information more readily available. Now, whether that's by having somebody whose job it is to crack the whip, or we've already discussed earlier some clearer guidelines about the level of data to which all bodies will be expected to conform. But I think at a stroke, a lot of the issues we talk about, the time that's spent answering these responses would be addressed if there was just a much more open approach to data that's often not particularly controversial. It just adds to people's understanding about the organisations that help to run their lives, and I think we should have a more consistent approach. Whether that's a person or clearer guidelines from overarching council bodies and so on about what is expected of their members, I'm not entirely sure, but as a media organisation, we would clearly welcome that, because I think what we can do then with that data is a benefit to everybody.
I think it comes down to two things. I mean, first of all, two words: public and service. That's what public bodies do. They serve the public, and so it just seems absolutely strange to me that there should be any reluctance to release information which is the public's information. And the second thing is it comes down to leadership, and I think it's something which should come down from the top of any organisation. And unless people at the top of those organisations are driving it and are making it a priority, with the understanding, the simple understanding that the more you can tell the public and explain to the public, the more likely that you are to increase confidence. Because, I mean, I have a simple sort of mantra which I trot out, which is that secrecy breeds suspicion and contempt, and openness breeds confidence and respect. And, you know, it's as simple as that. And if people at the top of organisations just grasp that and get it down right through all the ranks of their organisations, I think it would make a huge difference.
I was very struck by the paragraph 54 of your evidence about the problems with the manner in which the Act is working, about government departments, who fail to meet their statutory obligations and the way they deal with things, but also this issue about excessively expensive requests. And I think one of the things that we've noticed about the evidence that we've had, both from requesters and from the public authorities, is this has become really rather a tribal battle. I mean, it reminds me when I was doing the hunting inquiry for, for Jack 15 years ago, that there's very little movement from either side, where it does seem to me that there is an awful lot here where progress could be made by being able to deal with some of these vexatious issues, but at the same time dealing with some of these very delayed answers and ways in which things are operating in a very inefficient way, whereby the information is dragged out over a long period of time. And this is what I think we're been trying to refer to through the course of the day, about some of the uncertainties about the Act and some of the battlegrounds that have built up about the Act, which seem to us not beyond the bounds of being able to be resolved.
Well, the battleground is often about it seeming as though somebody is trying to hide something, cover up or whatever, isn't it? I mean, it actually makes the situation worse. And there's a simple answer, I think, in most cases as to when mistakes may have been made, is to the sooner you answer them, the sooner the problem will go away, actually. Yep. And the sooner that public confidence will be restored.
Okay, well, thank you very much, both of you, for both your evidence and for the way that you've answered the questions. Thank you. And we now have a break, and we will be back at 25 past